The doll that came to life. Imagine a doll, its painted eyes staring blankly at you, sitting perfectly still on a shelf, waiting. But what if that doll wasn't just a doll? What if it could move, breathe, and even think? Tonight, I'm going to tell you the terrifying story of the doll that came to life. Trust me, you won't be able to sleep after this one. Now, before we begin, I want to hear your thoughts. Comment below with any creepy experiences of your own or tell me what kind of stories you want to hear next. The room was quiet. Almost too quiet. The kind of silence that made you feel like you weren't alone. Sarah had always hated the attic, but when her grandmother passed away and left her the house, she didn't have a choice. There, in a dusty corner of the attic, she found a doll. A porcelain one, its skin pale, its hair dark and tangled. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow her every move. She felt uneasy, but she took it downstairs, placing it carefully on the shelf in her living room. That night, she woke up to the sound of something creaking. She didn't think much of it at first. Old houses did that sometimes, but then she heard it again. A soft, dragging sound, like something scraping against the floor. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she stood up, her feet cold on the wooden floor. She tiptoed toward the living room, her eyes landing on the shelf where the doll had been. But the doll wasn't there. She looked around frantically. Her eyes caught the faintest movement near the hallway. The doll was standing in the doorway, its head tilted slightly, its eyes locked onto her. Sarah froze. Her pulse raced as she took a step back. Was it her imagination? She couldn't be sure, but she was certain that the doll hadn't been there before. It was supposed to be sitting on the shelf. But now it was moving, slowly, like it was testing its newfound freedom. "Get back in your place," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. She quickly grabbed the doll and rushed it back to the shelf, hands shaking as she placed it back where it belonged. But the uneasy feeling stayed with her, creeping under her skin like a chill that wouldn't go away. The next day, Sarah decided to ask around. Her neighbor, Mrs. Whitmore, had lived in the town her whole life. If anyone knew about the house and its secrets, it would be her. Sarah knocked on her door, and Mrs. Whitmore invited her in with a warm smile, but her eyes were filled with something. A sort of warning. "You found it, didn't you?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. "Found what?" "The doll," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must be careful with that doll. It has a history." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "It's said to have a mind of its own. That doll. It's not just a toy. People believe it was cursed, and that whoever owns it will experience strange things. People have disappeared, gone mad. All because of that doll. I don't know what it is, but you need to get rid of it." Sarah laughed nervously. "That's just a story, right? Just a silly superstition." But the look in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes told a different story. Later that night, Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. She had placed the doll back on the shelf, but now she found it lying face down on the floor. It wasn't possible. She had made sure it was seated carefully. She picked it up again, heart pounding in her chest, but this time, she swore she heard a faint whisper. Soft, barely audible, but there. It wasn't her imagination. It was coming from the doll. "Put me back." Sarah froze, the doll's words echoing in her mind. She held it tightly, feeling its cold porcelain skin against her hand. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This couldn't be real. But when she turned around to put the doll back on the shelf, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the hallway mirror, reflected behind her, was a shadow. A dark, twisted shape. It was large, towering over her, but when she whipped around, no one was there. The shadow wasn't in the hallway. But it was in the mirror. Her heart raced as she backed away, but her foot hit something hard. Looking down, she saw that the doll was no longer in her hand. It had vanished. Panic surged through Sarah as she searched the room, but it wasn't until she turned around that she saw it. The doll was standing by the front door, its eyes locked onto hers once more. But this time, its mouth was open slightly, as if it was trying to speak. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The windows creaked, and the house seemed to groan under some unseen weight. Sarah ran to the door, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though something was holding it closed, something far stronger than she could ever hope to overpower. Then she heard it again, the whispering. The doll was moving. Slowly, dragging itself across the floor toward her. The room grew colder. The wall seemed to close in, and Sarah realized with horror that the doll wasn't just alive, it was after her. It wanted something. It wanted to make sure she never left. Desperate, Sarah searched the room for anything that could help her escape, but all she found was the doll's shadow, stretching longer and longer as it crawled closer. And as its shadow finally reached her, she could feel its cold fingers brush against her ankle. In that moment, Sarah knew she was trapped. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you believe the doll was cursed, or was Sarah just losing her mind? Comment below and share your thoughts. Also, let me know if you have any creepy experiences of your own or if you'd like to hear more of these chilling tales.